If you've ever stood on a high mountain ridge during a winter gale, you know the sound a conventional wall makes. It thuds, it shudders, it fights the air, taking the full kinetic energy of the wind and trying to stop it cold. The result is a violent vibration that travels through the timbers and into the bones of anyone trying to sleep inside. But on a granite ledge at 8,000 feet, just as the sun began to fail behind the peaks, there was a structure that made a different sound entirely. It was a low, steady hiss. Sitting on the rock was a perfect circle of white ash, a lattice of bent wood that looked less like a fortress and more like a basket woven by a giant. It appeared fragile, almost absurdly delicate against the gray scale of the approaching storm front. There were no thick logs, no heavy iron bolts, just thin strips of wood and the promise of tension. The barometer in the valley had already bottomed out, signaling a low-pressure system from the northwest that would carry wind speeds capable of snapping a pine tree in half. To the casual observer, the man standing inside that fragile wooden ring was preparing to die. He was betting his life on a shape, trusting that the geometry of the circle could do what the brute strength of the square could not. The man with the shovel had spent 10 years repairing the mistakes of other builders. He had seen enough rotting sill plates and black mold in the corners of rectangular cabins to understand that the traditional log home had a fatal flaw. He called it the tyranny of the corner. In a standard cabin, the corner is a geometric mistake. It is a massive thermal bridge, a place where wood overlaps wood, creating a dense pathway for heat to migrate out of the structure. More importantly, a corner is where the air dies. Inside a square room, the heat from a stove rises, hits the ceiling, and rolls toward the walls. When it hits a corner, the convection current stalls. The air becomes stagnant. These dead zones are where the cold penetrates first, where the condensation forms, and where the dampness settles into the timber. You can burn a cord of wood a week and still feel the draft on your neck because the geometry of the room is fighting the physics of the heat. He refused to build a box that would fight him for every degree of warmth. But the rejection of the square was not just about heat. It was about the wind. He was not an architect, and he had no degree in structural engineering. He was a man who understood the behavior of fluids. He knew that air at 8,000 feet behaves exactly like water in a fast-moving river. When a river hits a flat rock, the face of a square building, the water piles up against the obstruction, creating a high-pressure zone on the upstream side and a chaotic, turbulent, low-pressure zone on the downstream side. That turbulence is what rips roofs off. It creates a vacuum that pulls at the eaves, working the nails loose over years of storms. He chose a building site that would have terrified a conventional carpenter. He picked the most exposed point on the ridge, a place where the granite was scoured clean by the prevailing westerlies. A square cabin built here would have been hammered into kindling within a season. But he wasn't building a dam to stop the wind. He was building a stone in the stream. He needed the wind. He needed the velocity of the air to scrub the snow off his roof so he wouldn't have to shovel it. The foundation reflected this understanding of the mountain's movement. He did not pour concrete. Concrete is rigid. It assumes the earth is still. But at this altitude, the frost heave can lift the ground 3 inches in January and drop it back in April. A rigid foundation cracks. Instead, he used the method of the dry stone wallers. He gathered granite scree from the slope and laid a ring of stone directly on the bedrock, fitting them together without a single ounce of mortar. The stones were set with their long axis pointing into the center of the circle, creating a friction lock that gravity would only tighten over time. This was a floating foundation. When the ground heaved, the stones would shift microscopically, riding the movement of the earth like a raft on a slow swell, then settling back into place when the thaw came. It was a structure designed to accept the reality of the environment, rather than resist it. The ring was complete, a level circle of gray stone waiting for the wood that would have to bend to fit it. The stone foundation was waiting. A heavy, static ring settled into the granite. But the skeleton that would rise from it required a material that possessed the opposite qualities of stone. Stone is strong in compression. You can pile a mountain on top of it and it will not yield. But stone cannot bend. Stone has no elasticity. To build a circle that could survive a 100-mile-an-hour wind load, the man needed wood that could act like a spring. He needed a material that could absorb the kinetic energy of a gale, flex to accept the pressure, and then return to its original shape the moment the wind died down. He could not go to the lumber yard in the valley for this. The lumber yard sold pine and spruce that had been kiln-dried until it was dead, stable, and brittle. If you tried to bend a kiln-dried 2x4 into the radius required for a yurt, it would snap with the violence of a gunshot before you achieved even 10 degrees of curvature. The moisture that allowed the wood to be pliable had been cooked out of it. He needed wood that was still alive, or at least wood that remembered it had been alive recently. He needed green timber, wood where the cell walls were still saturated with the water pulled up from the roots. He walked the north slope of the ridge, looking for Fraxinus americana, white ash. In the hierarchy of American hardwoods, oak is the king of strength, but ash is the king of flexibility. It is the wood used for baseball bats, tool handles, and snowshoe frames because it has a unique ability to absorb shock without splintering. Its grain is long, straight, and remarkably consistent. But not just any ash tree would do. He looked for trees that had grown slowly in the shadow of the ridge, where the competition for sunlight was fierce. Slow growth meant tight growth rings. Tight rings meant density. He selected trees that were straight as plumb lines for the first 20 feet, with no low branches to create knots. A knot is a scar in the grain, a deviation in the fibers that becomes a fatal weak point when you put the wood under tension. The harvesting was a race against the air. Once the tree was felled, the moisture clock began ticking. He couldn't drag the logs to a mill. He had to process them right there on the slope. And he could not use a saw. This was the most critical distinction in the entire construction process, the detail that separated a structure that would last a century from one that would fail in the first storm. When you push a log through a circular saw, the blade cuts a geometrically straight line through an organic, imperfect object. The tree might have a slight twist or a gentle curve in its grain, but the saw ignores this. It slices across the fibers, creating what woodworkers call runout. If you look at a sawed board, the grain lines often run off the edge of the piece. Every place the grain runs out is a severed fiber, a broken connection. If you try to bend that board, the tension will find that severed fiber, and the wood will tear itself apart. To keep the strength of the tree intact, he had to split the wood, not cut it. He used a tool called a froe, a heavy L-shaped blade, and a wooden mallet, a beetle, carved from a hickory knot. He would drive the froe into the end grain of the log and lever the handle. The wood would crack open with a loud, sharp report, the split running down the length of the log. Unlike a saw, the split followed the grain perfectly. It snaked around minor imperfections, keeping the long fibers continuous from one end of the board to the other. This process, called riving, is labor-intensive and wasteful. A saw can turn 80% of a log into lumber. Riving might yield only 50%. But the wood that remains is structurally superior in every way. He spent 3 weeks riving the ash. He needed 80 roof rafters, each 8 feet long. He needed hundreds of thinner strips for the lattice walls, the kana that would form the vertical skeleton. By the time he was finished, his hands were stained dark with the oxidation of the wet sap, and the pile of white strips lay under a tarp, heavy with water, waiting for the heat that would make them obey the circle. The pile of rived ash lying under the tarp was structurally perfect, but geometrically useless. In its natural state, wood is stubborn. It wants to remain straight. If you take a 1-inch thick strip of seasoned ash and try to force it into the tight radius required for a roof rafter, the fibers on the outside of the curve will tear apart under the tension, while the fibers on the inside will crush under the compression. The result is a catastrophic failure, a splintered ruin that offers no structural integrity. To build a circle, the man had to stop treating the wood like a solid and start treating it like a plastic. He had to unlock the chemistry of the tree. He built a steam box to do it. It was a crude, coffin-like structure hammered together from rough pine planks, 18 feet long and propped up on sawhorses. He sealed the seams with old rope and pine tar to hold the pressure. The boiler was a salvaged 50-gallon steel drum set horizontally over a trench fire dug into the frozen earth. A galvanized pipe connected the drum to the box. He filled the drum with snowmelt, lit the fire, and waited for the physics to change. When the water hit a rolling boil, the steam roared into the box. the air around the site filled with a smell that is unmistakable to anyone who has bent timber. The scent of cooking sap, hot, wet bark, and the acrid, earthy perfume of the forest floor being distilled. Inside the dark, wet oven of the box, the steam was performing a molecular magic trick on the ash. Wood is essentially a bundle of cellulose fibers held together by a natural glue called lignin. At normal temperatures, lignin is rigid, acting like concrete around the rebar of the cellulose. But lignin is a thermoplastic. When you heat it to 212 degrees Fahrenheit in a moisture-saturated environment, it hits its glass transition point. It softens. It turns from a rock-hard glue into a pliable gel. The rule of thumb for steaming is 1 hour in the box for every inch of wood thickness. The man fed the fire and watched his watch. He knew that impatience was the most expensive mistake a bender could make. Pull the wood too early and the lignin is still hard. The wood will break. Leave it too long and the wood cooks, becoming brittle and useless. When the hour was up, the process shifted from a slow vigil to a frantic, violent race. This is the 1-minute rule. The moment the wood leaves the steam box, it begins to cool. The lignin starts to harden immediately. You have roughly 60 seconds to take the timber from the box, get it into the bending jig, and clamp it into its new shape. If you miss that window, the wood sets, and the opportunity is gone forever. He worked with heavy leather gloves, the steam billowing around him in the freezing mountain air. He would slide a slat of ash out of the box, the wood radiating a scalding, wet heat. He ran it to the jig, a curved wooden form bolted to a granite outcrop. He locked one end, grabbed the other, and pulled. This was the moment of truth. He could feel the wood yielding, the fibers sliding past each other in their gel-like bath of hot lignin. It felt less like bending a stick and more like bending a stiff rubber hose. He clamped it down, overbending it by 10% to account for the springback that would happen when it was released. But the danger was always there. Sometimes, despite the riving and the steaming, a piece of wood would refuse to yield. You would be leaning your entire body weight into the bend, the timber loaded with hundreds of pounds of potential energy, and then, without warning, it would snap. A steam bending failure is not a quiet crack. It is an explosion. The wood splinters release all that stored energy in a fraction of a second, whipping the broken end out with enough force to break a wrist, shatter teeth, or knock a man unconscious. He worked alone, miles from help, treating every bend with the respect one gives a loaded weapon. Once the ribs were bent and cooled, the lignin rehardened, locking the fibers into their new curve. The memory of the straight tree was gone, replaced by the memory of the circle. He then began the assembly of the kana, the lattice walls. He drilled thousands of holes and tied the intersection points with knotted rawhide that he had soaked to make pliable. The result was not a rigid fence, but a dynamic mechanism. The wall sections could fold flat for transport or expand like an accordion. When he stood the sections up and connected them, they formed a perfect cylinder that felt alive. If you pushed on the wall, it didn't just resist, it flexed, the entire lattice distributing the force across hundreds of joints. It expanded and contracted like a lung, a structure designed to breathe with the mountain rather than stand still and break. The lattice walls were standing, breathing in the mountain air, and the central compression ring was hoisted into place on a temporary prop, waiting in the center of the circle like a floating crown. But at this stage, the structure was effectively a death trap. To the untrained eye, it looked like a building. To the man who understood the behavior of vectors, it was a mechanism waiting to destroy itself. This is the paradox of the roundhouse. It is inherently stronger than a square, but only if you close the loop. Until that loop is closed, gravity is its enemy. In a conventional cabin, the roof is a series of triangles, trusses. The weight of the snow pushes down on the peak, and the bottom cord of the truss, the horizontal beam, ties the walls together, preventing them from spreading. The triangle is rigid. It solves its own problems. But inside the circle, there are no triangles. There are no crossbeams to bang your head on. The roof is a cone, an open cathedral of space. When you place a rafter from the central ring to the top of the wall, and then pile 3 feet of heavy, wet snow on top of it, the force does not just go down, it goes out. It is simple Newtonian physics. The roof wants to flatten. To flatten, the rafters must push the tops of the walls outward. Without something to stop that outward thrust, the beautiful lattice walls would simply splay open like a flower blooming in fast motion, and the roof would come crashing down to the floor. The entire integrity of the building, the safety of the sleeper inside, relied on counteracting that massive outward shove. He didn't need a beam, he needed a belt. This is the principle of the tension band. It is the single most critical component in the entire system, the Jesus nut of the yurt. If the foundation shifts, the house settles. If a rafter cracks, the roof sags. But if the tension band snaps, the building explodes. The man had to build an invisible wall of pure tension that could squeeze the building harder than the snow could push it apart. He climbed the ladder with a heavy coil of steel cable over his shoulder. Traditional builders on the steppes of Mongolia used braided horsehair or camel hide, materials that had a natural give and could be tightened as the humidity changed. But on this ridge, with a 100-mile-an-hour wind forecast, he chose the unforgiving certainty of steel. It was a 3/8-inch aircraft cable, scavenged from an abandoned logging winch in the valley. It was greasy, heavy, and cold, a snake of braided industrial strength that cared nothing for tradition, only for load. He walked the perimeter of the wall tops, feeding the cable into the notches he had cut into the tops of the khana. This was the barrel principle in action. A wine barrel is made of vertical wooden staves that want to fall outward. The only thing holding them in is the steel hoop. The hoop converts the outward pressure of the liquid into inward compression on the wood. The harder the liquid pushes out, the tighter the staves lock together. The man was building a barrel to live in, but instead of wine pressing out, it was the weight of the winter sky. The installation was a wrestling match with potential energy. He overlapped the ends of the cable and attached a heavy turnbuckle, a steel screw mechanism that would allow him to crank the band tight. He began to turn the wrench. At first, there was just the slack coming out of the line, the cable lifting and seating itself into the wood. Then, the resistance began. As he cranked, the structure began to speak. The lattice walls, which had been floppy and loose, started to groan. The cable bit into the ash ribs, sinking a fraction of an inch into the grain. With every turn of the wrench, the invisible wall got stronger. He was pre-stressing the building, introducing thousands of pounds of inward force before a single snowflake had fallen. He was banking strength for the storm. Suddenly, the tone of the structure changed. The creaking stopped. The loose rattling of the joints vanished. The frame let out a single, deep pop. The sound of 80 rafters and hundreds of wall junctions locking into a singular, rigid unit. The tension band was tight. He struck the cable with the wrench, and it rang like a piano string tuned to the key of high C. The floppy basket had become a fortress. The outward thrust of the roof was now trapped, converted by the steel band into a crushing hug that made the walls stronger the heavier the load got. The physics were satisfied. The circle was closed. The trap was set. Not for the man, but for the wind. The heavy steel cable had turned the fragile wooden basket into a rigid structure, but a skeleton, no matter how strong, cannot stop the cold. At 8,000 feet, the air does not just sit, it penetrates. It seeks out heat with the relentless efficiency of water seeking a drain. To survive the winter, the man needed to wrap his wooden bones in flesh. In the valley below, the standard solution for insulation was fiberglass, pink, fluffy rolls of spun glass that looked like cotton candy and worked on the principle of trapped air. But the man on the ridge knew the dirty secret of fiberglass. It is a material designed for a perfect world. A world where roofs never leak and humidity never rises. Fiberglass is static. It hates water. If a standard fiberglass bat gets wet, the glass fibers mat down, the air pockets collapse, and its insulating value, its R value, drops to near zero. Worse, it acts like a sponge, holding the moisture against the wood until the rot sets in. To make it work, you have to seal it behind a plastic vapor barrier, effectively wrapping your house in a trash bag. This traps the moisture from your breath and your cooking inside, turning the cabin into a sweat box where mold blooms in the corners. He refused to live in a plastic bag. He needed an insulation that could handle the cloud banks that would sit on the ridge for days, saturating everything with a fine, freezing mist. He looked to the experts on cold weather survival in the region, the sheep. The local farmers in the valley raised Corriedale and Merino crosses, breeds with dense, heavy fleeces. When the winter storms rolled in, these animals stood in the freezing rain and snow for days, yet their skin remained dry and warm. They didn't die of hypothermia because they were wearing a material that modern chemistry has yet to fully replicate. The man took his truck to the shearing barns. He didn't want the clean, processed wool that had been scoured with chemicals to remove the grease. He wanted the raw, dirty fleeces, the skirting that the mills often rejected. He wanted the grease. That grease is lanolin. It is a complex, waxy oil secreted by the sebaceous glands of the sheep. In a raw fleece, it coats every single fiber. Lanolin is the key to the miracle. It makes the wool hydrophobic, water repellent, on a macroscopic level. If you pour water on a raw fleece, it beads up and rolls off. But the interior of the wool fiber is hygroscopic. It loves water. It can absorb up to 30% of its weight in moisture vapor without feeling wet to the touch or losing its loft. He brought the fleeces up the mountain in burlap sacks, smelling of the barnyard, of manure and musk and oil. The installation was not a precise carpentry job. It was a stuffing process. He packed the raw wool between the outer canvas skin of the yurt and the inner liner, pressing it into the voids of the lattice wall. He built a mat 6 inches thick. In terms of raw numbers, this gave him an R value of roughly 25, comparable to a high-end modern wall. But the numbers on a page didn't account for the reality of the ridge. As he worked, his hands became coated in the thick, yellow lanolin. It waterproofed his skin just as it would waterproof the house. The sensory experience was overwhelming. The cabin didn't smell like lumber or drywall. It smelled like a living animal. It was a heavy, earthy scent that signaled safety to a primal part of the brain. He was not building a wall that blocked the environment. He was building a membrane that negotiated with it. This became evident the moment the first cold snap hit. In a plastic-wrapped house, the humidity from his breath would have condensed on the windows. In the yurt, the wool walls began to work. As the interior humidity rose, the wool fibers absorbed the moisture vapor. This is where the physics of wool becomes almost magical. The absorption of water molecules into the keratin structure of the wool is an exothermic reaction. It releases heat. When the wool absorbed the dampness from the air, the walls actually generated a small amount of thermal energy, releasing it back into the room. It was a phase change battery. The house was not just holding the heat from the stove, it was actively participating in the thermal equation. The drier the air outside and the damper the air inside, the harder the walls worked. He had built a structure that didn't just insulate, it breathed. It took the moisture that would have killed a fiberglass wall and used it to generate warmth. The skeleton was steel and ash, but the skin was alive, oily, and breathing, waiting for the wind to test how well it could hold a ghost of heat against the coming freeze. The calendar turned to late November, and the air on the ridge underwent a fundamental shift. The playful breezes of autumn, which had merely rustled the dry leaves of the scrub oaks, were replaced by the scouting parties of the true winter. These were the calibration gales, constant winds of 30 to 40 miles per hour that probed every structure for a weakness. In the valley, these winds were a nuisance that rattled windows. On the exposed granite shelf at 8,000 feet, they were a physical force that possessed mass and intent. For a conventional builder, wind is an enemy that must be blocked. A rectangular cabin with a peaked roof is, aerodynamically speaking, a confused collection of flat surfaces that fight the air. When a 40-mile-per-hour wind strikes the vertical face of a square house, it stalls. The pressure spikes. The air is forced violently upward and around the corners. When it crests the peak of a standard A-frame roof, the airflow separates from the surface, creating a chaotic zone of turbulence on the leeward side. This turbulence creates a powerful vacuum, a suction force that pulls upward on the shingles and sheathing. This is the physics of lift. It is the same principle that allows a heavy airplane to leave the runway. The wing is curved on top and flat on the bottom to generate this upward pull. A standard house is essentially a wing that is bolted to the ground. As the wind speed increases, the lift increases. The house wants to fly. The only things keeping the roof on are the nails and gravity. Eventually, if the wind blows hard enough, the lift overcomes the weight of the timber, and the roof is stripped away like the lid of a tin can. The man on the ridge watched the wind hit his circle, and he saw a completely different physical reaction. The yurt did not fight the wind. It invited the air to pass. Because the structure was round, there was no flat face to stall the air. The wind split smoothly around the curve, maintaining what engineers call laminar flow. The air stayed attached to the surface of the walls and the roof. Here is where the mathematics of Daniel Bernoulli, an 18th century Swiss physicist, became the most important tool in the man's survival kit. Bernoulli's principle states a simple, counterintuitive fact. As the speed of a fluid increases, its pressure decreases. Because the wind had to travel a longer distance over the curve of the dome than it did along the flat ground, it had to speed up. It accelerated as it swept over the conical roof. According to the equation, this acceleration created a zone of low pressure directly above the yurt. But unlike the turbulence behind a peaked roof, this low pressure was uniform and stable. The pressure inside the yurt was normal atmospheric pressure. The pressure above the roof was significantly lower. The result was not lift, but a net downward force. The atmosphere itself was pushing the roof down onto the walls. The harder the wind blew, the faster the air moved over the curve. The faster the air moved, the lower the pressure dropped. The lower the pressure dropped, the harder the building was pressed against the granite foundation. It was a structural paradox that defied common sense. The storm that should have destroyed the shelter was actually making it more stable. The wind was acting like a giant, invisible hand, holding the yurt onto the mountain. The man verified this, not with instruments, but with the snow. When the first heavy flakes began to fall in the horizontal wind, he watched them approach the structure. They didn't pile up against the windward wall. They didn't accumulate in a drift on the roof. The accelerated airflow scoured the shingles clean. The velocity of the air over the dome was so high that the snow couldn't settle. It was carried over the peak and deposited in a perfect ring-shaped drift 10 feet away from the walls. The wind was shoveling his roof for him. Inside, the geometry was managing the heat with the same efficiency. In a square cabin, the corners are cold, stagnant pockets where mold grows. In the cylinder, the heat from the central stove rose in a column to the compression ring. It hit the conical ceiling and rolled down the curved walls in a perfect 360-degree curtain of warmth. It washed over the wool insulation, keeping the living skin dry and warm, before curling back along the floor to feed the stove. It was a convective loop, a thermal flywheel, that kept the air moving and the temperature uniform. The physics held. The circle was working. But the barometer was still falling. The theoretical physics of Daniel Bernoulli were about to undergo a practical audit. The aneroid barometer hanging on the central post did not merely dip. The needle fell as if the internal spring had snapped. It dropped 20 millibars in 3 hours, a rate of change that any sailor or mountaineer recognizes as the signature of a catastrophe. In the valley below, the old-timers were nailing shutters closed and bringing the livestock into the lower barns. On the ridge, the man watched the sky turn a color that shouldn't exist in nature, a bruised, heavy purple that swallowed the peaks one by one. This was not a squall. This was the Great Gale, a collision of Arctic high pressure and moist oceanic low pressure that history would record for the number of roofs it stripped and the timber it flattened. Then came the temperature. It didn't slide, it crashed. At 2 p.m., the thermometer read a manageable 30 degrees. By 4 p.m., the mercury had retreated into the bulb, registering 20 below zero. That is a 50-degree swing in 120 minutes. The violence of that drop does strange things to a landscape. The sap trapped inside the nearby spruce trees froze so instantly that the wood couldn't expand fast enough. The trees exploded, sounding like rifle fire echoing across the granite shelf. Crack, 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 as the forest literally burst apart from the cold. The moisture in the air turned to ice fog, a blinding wall of white that reduced visibility to the length of a shovel handle. But the cold was silent. The wind was not. It began as a low, resonant moan in the valley floor, miles below. It climbed the slope, gaining speed and mass with every foot of elevation. By the time it hit the tree line, it was no longer moving air. It was a physical wall of atmosphere moving at 80 miles per hour. The sound was not a whistle. It was a roar, a constant, deafening vibration that felt like a freight train derailment happening in slow motion directly outside the door. It was the sound of millions of tons of air being forced over a granite speed bump, and the yurt was sitting directly on the apex of that bump. The man moved with the deliberate slowness of someone who knows that panic is the first step toward freezing to death. He checked the door latch. A heavy oak bar dropped into iron brackets. He walked to the perimeter of the khana, running his hand along the tension band. The steel cable was vibrating, humming a low, dangerous note as the roof load increased. He gave the turnbuckle one final quarter turn, feeling the resistance of the entire structure fighting back. He wasn't just tightening a bolt. He was arming the weapon that would fight the wind. He checked the seal of the canvas where it met the foundation, ensuring the snow had packed tight against the granite skirting. He fed the stove, not pine, which burns fast and hot, but dense rounds of hickory and oak, fuel that would hold a coal bed for hours. He adjusted the damper, slowing the draft to a steady purr. Then he sat down. This is the moment where the psychology of the circle reveals itself. In a square cabin, the wind hammering a flat wall feels like a personal assault. You feel the structure shuddering, taking the blows. Inside the yurt, the violence was audible, but it felt distant. The wind was slipping around them. The candle on the table didn't flicker. The column of heat from the stove rose straight up, undisturbed by the chaos tearing the world apart just 6 inches away. The thermal flywheel was spinning, holding a steady 65 degrees against the 20 below outside. The wind speed indicator ticked upward. The test had begun. The wind speed climbed past 90 miles per hour, and the sound of the world changed. It ceased to be a noise and became a pervasive vibration, a frequency that rattled the teeth and settled deep in the chest. This was the point of failure for the rigid world. Outside, the frozen spruce trees, which had stood on the ridge for 50 years, began to die. They were strong, but they were stiff. When the gusts hit them, they tried to stand their ground. The sound of their failure penetrated the insulated walls. Sharp, explosive cracks like artillery fire as trunks 2 feet thick snapped under the sheer force. Inside the circle, the physics of survival looked different. The yurt did not stand still. It began to move. To a modern mind raised in static boxes of drywall and concrete, a moving wall is the ultimate sign of danger. It triggers a primal panic. But the man sat by the stove, watching the diamond-shaped lattice of the khana, and he saw the genius of the steam-bent ash. The wall on the windward side bowed inward. It flexed a full inch under the hammer blow of the gust. In a square cabin, a wall bowing an inch is a precursor to a catastrophic collapse. Here, it was simply the structure exhaling. The energy of the wind did not break the wood. It traveled through it. The force hitting the north wall was transferred instantly along the lattice, flowing around the curve to the south side, dissipating into the friction of the tied joints. The entire building was acting like a giant, circular spring. The roof rafters groaned as they took the load, a deep, wooden complaint that sounded like the hull of a ship working in heavy seas. It was the sound of the lignin stretching, the memory of the grain being tested to its limit. High above the stove, the tension band began to sing. The steel cable, already pre-stressed to thousands of pounds, was now holding the entire weight of the storm. As the roof pressed down and the walls tried to expand, the cable tightened further. It emitted a high, continuous drone, a note of pure tension that cut through the roar of the wind. This was the invisible wall holding the line. If that cable snapped, the roof would flatten, and the walls would explode outward in a fraction of a second. The man watched the turnbuckle, the threaded steel shining in the lantern light. It held. The barrel principle was converting the violence of the gale into a crushing embrace that only made the joints tighter. The hours stretched out. The man fed the stove, maintaining the heartbeat of the house. The thermal flywheel held the interior temperature steady, a bubble of 65-degree air suspended in a chaos of 20 below. He was warm, not because he had fought the cold with brute force, but because he had built a machine that negotiated with it. He drank his coffee and listened to the forest being dismantled outside, trusting his life to the flexibility of the ash and the geometry of the circle. Sometime before dawn, the singing of the cable dropped an octave. The groaning of the rafters eased into a settling creak. The storm had broken its back against the ridge. The silence that followed was louder than the wind. When the sun finally crested the eastern peaks, it illuminated a landscape that had been scrubbed clean. The yurt was buried on the north side, a drift of snow sweeping up to the compression ring, but the structure itself hadn't shifted an inch. The door pushed open against the white weight, and the man stepped out into the cold, clear morning. The circle remained unbroken. The yurt stood in the snow, a perfect geometric anomaly in a field of broken timber. It had survived, not because it was stronger than the storm, but because it had refused to fight it. The ash bent, the wool breathed, and the circle distributed the pain until the wind gave up. Survival is rarely about being the hardest object on the mountain. It is about finding the shape that nature cannot destroy. If you want to see the specific knot used to secure the tension band, check the next video where we break down the lashing technique. Subscribe to keep the old ways alive.